Let's get started here. All right. So here's the bad news. First of all, a lot of experts say that we're 228 years behind whites when it comes to wealth. I don't believe we're behind anybody. I believe that we should be more focused not so much on how far behind we are relative to white people, but how far are we behind relative to where we can be? How far are we behind where we should be as a people? One of the interesting things about the black wealth issue, or what they call the wealth gap, is that there are some experts who might argue that is there really how real is this gap, in the sense that which benchmark is appropriate? Who do we compare ourselves to? Like for example, there are countries on this earth. 90% of the countries on this earth have less resources than the black community do. 90% of all countries, we could actually buy all of their gross domestic product. We could buy every good and service they produce for an entire year with the money that we spend on, hair, makeup, potato chips, houses, shoes, new cars, etc. And so here's the interesting thing, though. Over the last 30 years, the gap has actually grown. When people talk about that distance between white wealth and black wealth, a lot of people think that the gap is going to shrink just because time has passed, but that's not true. That's like running a race and you're 40 yards behind, and you think that because the race keeps going that you're eventually going to catch up with your opponent. You may never catch up. If your opponent's running faster than you, then you're going to keep falling behind. If you're sitting still or running backwards, then the gap is going to increase. It's not going to decrease. So black wealth hasn't increased very much. So the gap is actually growing in between whites and blacks. So yes, we're falling behind. If that's your measuring stick, if that's what you care about, then yes, we are falling behind. Now, and the interesting thing is that I've used the term illusion to talk about the black wealth gap because I don't like the fact that we focus so much on the gap, in the sense that it creates a kind of deficit thinking. A lot of times, if you think you don't have anything, then you don't tend to value what you have. If you're focused so much on what other people have, then it's very easy to forget what you actually have. When I was a little kid, I used to have cousins that got designer jeans and all the fancy new toys, and because I wanted what they had, I felt like my toys weren't worth anything. I felt like my clothes weren't worth anything. And my mother had to smack me upside the head and say, boy, don't you realize that there are kids out here who can't have any school clothes? And so ultimately, with the wealth conversation, we have to be very, very careful, because when you talk about the black community as destitute, as broke, as a community that simply has nothing, then what occurs is that people start to have a nothing and a poverty mentality. Why would you invest what you have if it's not worth anything? But actually, if you have a handful of seeds, that handful of seeds can become a tree full of fruit. But you got to be willing to plant the seeds. But if someone tells you that your seeds aren't worth anything, or that you need to wait for somebody else to bring you a fruit tree, then you're going to end up throwing your seeds away so you can sit there and wait for the tree to arrive. And that doesn't work. So there's more, actually. In 2010, the median net worth for black Americans was $4,900. For white Americans, it was about $97,000. This gap seems huge. It's very scary. A third of African Americans have zero or negative net worth, which is crazy. In the last 30 years, the wealthiest Americans saw their wealth increase by 786%. So the wealthiest Americans, and this isn't just white people, there are some black people in this category too. The people that are in the top 5%, top 10%, have seen massive increases in their wealth, largely because the dynamics of the country have shifted. The way money is allocated has changed. So ultimately, there are some people who figured it out. There's some people who score the wealth points very easily, and there are people who have a tough time, getting ahead at all. And so the easy temptation is to believe that it's sort of due to some invisible process that we can't have any say in, that it's just sort of luck or voodoo or oppression. And really, as a person who's been in all those spaces, like I've been around very, very, very poor black people because I grew up as one, and I've been around extremely wealthy white people. I'm going to meet with a billionaire tonight. I'm literally going to meet with a billionaire tonight. I've seen all these extremes in between. And so when I meet with the billionaires, I'm watching how they move, how do they train their kids? What do they talk to their children about to get them ready to compete in the economic system? And what I find is that there's a vast difference culturally in terms of how the children are raised. So here's the thing, being part of the top 10% of all Americans, that there's nothing magical about it. Anybody can do it if you give them enough time. From the very beginning, the first lecture of this program, I mentioned to you guys that time is your ticket. Time is your key to power economically. And so if you give anybody enough time, they can grow almost any amount of wealth. That's a mathematical fact. You also have to focus basically on three things: investing in stock, investing in real estate, investing in small businesses. Those are kind of the big three, as I call them, the big three areas where most investing takes place. So if you hit one of those three areas and you hit them all consistently, and you hit, let's say you hit all three of them, you diversify within each area, you should have enough going on economically that your income potential, just the way you think about income, shifts when you've got 30 different revenue streams. When you got, or 20 different revenues, when you got that many different ways that you can make money, it totally changes everything in terms of how you see income generation. Now, moving on. Now, so notice that your kids can also kill you financially from the grave. Now, I want to make sure you know this. 70% of all wealthy families actually lose all of their wealth within a generation. Now, a lot of y'all don't know this. So a lot of times when we think that all the wealth in America just came because, so-and-so's dad or so-and-so's mom passed the wealth on. Actually, white kids and black people are horrible when it comes to transgenerational passage of wealth. That's why I was reading about it and I said, oh my God, we've got to make sure we drill the heck out of our people on estate planning to avoid estate planning tax. Because I don't know if you know this, but when you die, you might have life insurance for your family, but did you know that the minute you die, your life insurance money goes into your estate? And Uncle Sam's like, oh, right there. Uncle Sam's going to take 40%. So you're thinking you're leaving 100,000 to your children. Nope, you're not. You're leaving 40,000 to Uncle Sam and 60,000 to your kids. So 60,000 going to go to your children. 40,000 goes to President Trump. So ultimately, estate planning allows you to protect yourself from that using trusts and things like that to make sure your assets have a smooth transition. Also, trusts allow you to create rules and parameters through which you pass that wealth on. You must protect your wealth from your kids because kids are financial idiots till they get to about 35 years old, unfortunately. They just aren't really ready to control your wealth. 90% of all Americans lose all of their wealth within 2 generations. So within 1 generation, you hit 70%. Within 2 generations, you're talking about 90%. So the question is, how do you get into that 10% where the wealth doesn't disappear? If you look back and you look at history, you look at great individuals like Madam C.J. Walker and Annie Malone. Annie Malone is the real superhero. Annie Malone is the one who taught Madam C.J. Walker how to build a business. Annie Malone was a female and superior version of Dr. Boyce Watkins. That's what Annie Malone was. Annie Malone was me on steroids. Annie Malone had a massive campus where she was educating thousands of black people on how to start businesses. She made a donation to Howard University in the 1920s of I want to say $25,000 or $30,000. Annie Malone was bad. When I read about Annie Malone, I didn't really think as much about Madam C.J. Walker, not to belittle her achievements, but I said, oh, well, she came from Annie Malone. So anyway, the problem though with Annie Malone was that a lot of the factors that can come in and impact your family empire that you're building by taking this program, a lot of those same factors that are going to come at you also came at Annie. She lost a lot of her money in divorces because she married the wrong men who kind of ended up taking a lot of what she had. Also, she made some tough investments that didn't quite work out. So when Annie finished the game, she didn't have nearly as many assets as she would have had with proper sort of protections and planning in place, right? So anyway, moving on. So basically, a lot of families lose their wealth because parents don't train their kids about money, number one. A lot of parents don't protect their money, number two. Also, they give money to their kids too early. The kids get access to it super early and they waste it. Excuse me. Also, there are few requirements for gaining the access to the money. So later on in the Black Stock Market program, when we start talking about, excuse me, estate planning and things like that, that's what we're going to drill into, protecting what you got. So what is wealth? First of all, wealth is not a paycheck. I know y'all know this, but I need to make sure I remind you that. A lot of people really think that wealth is connected to income, which it is in a way, but income is transitory. Income can be shut off like that. Wealth is something that's more permanent. Income can become wealth if the income is used in the right way. So income is like the water coming out of the faucet. Wealth is the bucket that's catching the water so that you actually have a big bucket of water to drink when you get thirsty, even if there's no water coming out of the faucet anymore. Wealth is an accumulation. It's not an accumulation of fancy material items. It's an accumulation of assets that grow in value, or assets that remain value. Sometimes the assets are financial, sometimes they're not. Wealth is not, it's not typically something like, how many pairs of shoes you have in your closet. I mean, that's a type of wealth, but it's very difficult to go out and sell your shoes. I mean, there is a little bit of a market, in some of the sneakers. I've heard about that. But for the most part, it's typically just not a good way to build wealth. The car that you have, it does have value, but the value is dropping on a regular basis. So whatever that car is worth today is going to be worth probably 20-30% less in a year or two from now. Ultimately with wealth, you want to have that long-term accumulation process in place where you're accumulating things, the stocks, the bonds, the real estate, the small businesses that are adding value, adding to your net worth.